We are now going to start the skeletal system. And the skeletal system is probably one of the more misunderstood systems in the body in terms of what it is actually responsible for. Most people think your skeleton is just what your muscles attach to and makes you move, but it actually has some very important jobs. So let's dive into the skeletal system. First of all, let me move my head here. There we go. Let's talk a little bit about what its job is. Oh, ran through that a little quickly. What are the jobs of the skeletal system? Well, the first one is pretty obvious, is support, right? Your skeletal system supports your muscles. It's what your muscles attach to. It's what gives your actual frame to your body. So when you look at yourself, the reason why your shoulders are the width that they are, the reason why you're as tall as you are, the reason why your hips are as wide as they are, that is all a function of how your frame is built from your skeletal system. So it's for support. It's also for protection. When you look at the skeleton, right, it has a rib cage, you have your cranium, you have your pelvic bones. Those are there to protect your organs, right? Obviously, your cranium is there to protect your brain. Your rib cage is there to protect your heart and your lungs. You have your pelvic bones to protect your reproductive organs. The only real part of your body where you have a lot of very delicate organs that are unprotected, that's going to be your abdominal area, right? All your digestive and excretory organs are just basically exposed without any bone there. We have these really expansive muscles there, our abdominal muscles, which are built to protect, but we don't have bones there. So nature made a decision, right? Why doesn't our rib cage just go all the way down to our hip bones in order to protect our abdominal? That would give us a lot more protection. Well, if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Adolf, then we wouldn't be able to move. We'd have no flexibility. Well, you'd be right. That is why, right? So nature makes these decisions. Evolution makes these decisions where if it's a detriment to survival, it's not going to happen. So over time, I'm sure there was at some point some animal that has a rib cage that extends all the way down to their hip bones, but that animal won't be able to move very quickly. And if there's a scenario where it's getting attacked, it would not be able to survive. So protection, it's there to protect. Another extremely important part of our skeletal system is the production, I should say, of blood cells. This is where our blood cells get made. It's a process called hematopoiesis, and in our bone marrow, that is where our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets get made. So if somebody has, for example, leukemia, which is cancer of the bone marrow, they produce either too many or not enough blood cells. And then finally, it's a really important storage for inorganic materials. What do I mean by that? Specifically, I'm talking about calcium. Calcium and phosphorus, but mainly calcium. We store calcium in our bones. At this point, if I were to say what's calcium used for in the human body, my guess is you would tell me to make our bones strong. And that is true, but that is a fraction of what calcium gets used for. Every single time a nerve cell fires off, calcium gets used. Every time a muscle cell fires off, calcium gets used. We use calcium as much or more than any other ion in the body. So calcium is extremely important, and our skeleton is where we store it. We keep it there so that way when we need it, we can pull it out, and we'll talk about that more later. Let's talk a little bit about how we classify bones. We classify them into 5 general shapes, and those shapes are long, short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid. So let me just take a moment to explain the differences between those, and then we'll keep moving through. A long bone is pretty self-explanatory. A long bone is going to be longer than it is wide. And that's going to be, for example, our femur. Our limbs are going to be our long bones. So we have our upper limbs, which is going to be your arms, obviously, which is made up of long bones. We have our humerus, our radius, and our ulna. And then we have our legs, our lower appendages, which are also made up of long bones, which are going to be your femur, your tibia, and your fibula, right? Then we have our short bones. And short bones, you can see over here, that example would be our something called our tarsals, which are going to be our foot bones. So those small bones there are going to be, and also on our wrists we have something called carpals. So these are small bones that are not long, right? They're going to be as wide as they are long. Then we have our flat bones. And flat bones, an example of that is going to be your sternum, right? So you have a flat bone, often called your breastplate, but that is a flat bone right in the middle of your chest, which your ribs attach to. That's your sternum right there. That is a protective bone, right? That your heart is right below it, so that's a good protective piece there. Your cranium, your skull is flat bone, and then your pelvic bones here. Those are called your iliac and your ilium. Those bones there are also flat. That is also where we keep our red bone marrow. So that is where our blood cells get made, and we'll talk more about that later. Irregular bones are going to be your vertebrae. So these have a specific shape that you can see. Anything that looks weird like this, there's a reason for it, right? So if you take a look at this, why does a vertebrae look like this? It looks crazy, right? What's going on here? Well, the vertebrae has several very important jobs, right? And we're going to talk all about the vertebrae in here. We're going to learn about them. But the vertebrae are there to support your weight. So you need this large piece down here. That's what's holding up your body weight there. That large, it's called the body of the vertebrae. This open hole here, that's where your spinal cord passes through. And then all these crazy pieces jutting off, that's for muscle attachment. When you move, all of your movement comes from your back here, right? So when you turn from side to side, any movement you make has a muscle attached to it. So there's a lot of very small muscles in your back that attach to these points that stick off called processes that allow you to move in all the many directions that your body can move. From our hips there, from our back, we can shift any direction. And then sesamoid just means circular. So there's not a whole lot of example of those. The main example would be our patella, but you probably know it as your kneecap, right? So if you were to put your leg out straight right now, so it's completely relaxed, you can shift your kneecap from side to side. You can actually feel it. You can get a good feel for the shape of your kneecap. It is a small circular bone that sits, and it has an important job for allowing your leg to move. We'll talk more about that later, but that's sesamoid. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to go through the structure of a long bone. So let's see if I can get through this. So let's just run through this now, and hopefully I can hit all this stuff in one lecture. If not, I'll break it into two. So when you look at a long bone, it's really, we're talking about a long bone now, not any of the other examples. It has length to it, obviously, but there's two ends, right? There's going to be one end on the superior portion and one end on the inferior portion. Those ends are called epiphysis or epiphyses. The way you can end that, remember that, is epiphysis starts with an E and end starts with an E. So the epiphysis or epiphyses are the ends of the bone. Every bone has two epiphyses, right? The epiphyseal disc is something you've heard of before, but you call it your growth plate. That is the growth plate. So that is this line that exists. It's in the epiphysis, and we're going to learn all about how that works later in this unit. We're going to learn how the growth plate works. But the growth plate or the epiphyseal disc or epiphyseal plate, it's called all those things, or line, they have a lot of different names, that exists in the epiphysis, and that is where the bone grows. So your bone actually grows from the ends. The diaphysis is the middle portion of the bone, so the shaft of the bone. So the epiphysis is the end, the diaphysis is the middle. I don't have a tricky way to remember that except for something really stupid. The diaphysis is the middle of the bone, or the shaft, DA. It's goofy, but it might help you remember. The center of your bone has a big hollowed-out cavity called the medullary cavity. It is the hollow bone in the center, it's the hollow cavity in the center of the diaphysis. So the epiphysis is full of something called spongy bone, which I'm going to be talking about. The diaphysis, on the other hand, has compact bone on the sides, which again, I'm going to talk more about that. And then in the middle, we have this medullary cavity. It is not empty space. It is actually full of marrow. It's full of fatty marrow, which we're going to talk about a little bit. So the medullary cavity is the hollow chamber in the center of the bone. Let's keep going through and see how far we get. The spongy bone, also called cancellous bone, that is going to be found in the epiphysis. So if you take a look at the bone up here, if you look at this picture, you can see the bone looks like it has a lot of holes in it. It looks kind of like a sponge, and that's because it has a structure like a sponge. It has a lot of open spaces there. In those open spaces, that is where marrow is, and that is where your blood cells get made. So we have red marrow at the ends of the bones, which, like I said, I'm going to talk about later. That is where we have blood cell production. So your blood cells are made at the ends of your bone. Your flat bones are also made of spongy bone. Compact bone, on the other hand, that is the other type of bone tissue, that is going to be found on the sides of the diaphysis. So the sides of the diaphysis are made up of compact bone. And I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. And then let's just finish up this slide, and that'll be a good stopping point. The outside of the bone has a layer called the periosteum. And the periosteum is a network of blood vessels and nerves on the outside of the bone. It's a very tough covering, and it's full of nerves. If you've ever hit your shin before, everybody feel your shin real quick. This is a bone that's a good example for this because it's one of the few bones that doesn't have a muscle layer over top of it. You can just feel it right below your skin, right? You can feel that shin bone. And if you've ever hit your shin before, you know how hard or how bad it hurts, right? If you hit it, it hurts really bad. And that's because that periosteum is getting hit, and that periosteum is full of blood vessels. The endosteum is on the inside of that cavity. So the inside of that cavity is lined with a layer of cells, which we're going to talk more about later. They're called osteoblasts, and they actually make the bone. So the bone gets made from the inside out, and we'll talk more about that later as well. So the endosteum is the layer on the inside of the cavity. The periosteum is a layer on the outside of the bone. And then finally, we have what we're going to call the articulating cartilage at the end of the bone. So the articulating cartilage exists at the ends of all your long bones, and that is made up of hyaline cartilage, which we learned about in the last section, right? We learned all about hyaline cartilage. It is tissue that has died, so it's basically there to prevent any friction, and it's basically there to protect the bone. So if you have cartilage at the ends of both of your bones, when they rub against each other, it's not going to cause any damage because that periosteum is going to be protected. So let me just finish up by just drawing a picture here just to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. So I'm just going to draw a picture here of a long bone, and we're going to do a little bit of just quick review of what I talked about. So we have our long bone here, right? We have our epiphyses at the ends, our diaphysis in the middle, so we have our epiphyses. And just to make sure we understand, at the ends we have spongy bone. And in the middle we have compact bone. And down the center of this diaphysis we have this open cavity called the medullary cavity, right? So this medullary cavity is open in the middle. I know this is not a very good drawing, but you get the point. So why would we have spongy bone at the ends and compact bone at the top? It has to do with weight. Spongy bone allows for lower weight. It doesn't weigh as much, but structural support. Because it's spongy, it sets up in a way that it decreases the weight of that bone. If this is all compact bone here, this bone would be very heavy. Compact bone at the edges, though, we need a strong support here. If you're going to break your bone, you're going to break it right here, right? That's where that bone's going to break. So what we have here is this compact bone is much stronger than the spongy bone. So imagine if you have to build a thinner wall, you want to make it out of a stronger substance. So we have spongy bone at the ends to provide some lightweight structural support at the ends. It also leaves space for that marrow, and then compact bone is going to be making up the diaphysis, and what that allows for is strong structural support to help protect that bone from breaking. Because if your bone's going to break, it's going to break in the middle. All right, we'll pick up here later on. Thank you.